The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome on board the RichPlanet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall, and I'm going to start things off with a comment on previous week's news. The alleged oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico now seems to have been forgotten about by mainstream news media. Our view is that they have not been asking the right questions and have merely been putting out the propaganda handed to them by the world's controlling elite. And there is more to this event than merely an accidental oil spill. The BBC news item which explained the operational headquarters of BP seemed to be aimed at 2.5-year-olds. In this room they are looking at the blowout preventer, and in this next room Humpty Dumpty is looking through the square window. What can we say about this disaster that the mainstream has failed to report? Firstly, there has been clear obstruction by those involved in controlling the area to prevent the public and journalists from going anywhere near where the alleged spill site is. Contractors who are supposed to be involved in a cleanup operation have all been warned not to speak to anyone about what they know and about what they are doing. Secondly, highly toxic dispersants such as Corexit are being used in massive, unsafe quantities. Some very strange circumstances have led many people to believe that this so-called disaster was deliberately started for some political or strategic reason. Some are alleging that the rig was above an undersea volcano and drilled to depths and at pressures that only previously achieved on land, making this far too dangerous to have ever even been considered, never mind attempted. Others are saying that the video of the oil spilling from the seabed is not genuine and has been fabricated. Also, there are several other oil leaks around the region that are actually the real cause of the oil spill. Toxic rain has been reported on the coasts nearby, which is affecting plant life. Massive security measures have been put in place to prevent people finding out what is really going on. Locals have also claimed that the cleanup operation is simply an empty gesture, and no cleanup operation is actually taking place along hundreds of miles of infected coastlines. The MI5 agent and international war criminal Tony Blair was rumoured in the British press to be in line for the top BP job. The reason Blair would be drafted in is presumably because they need someone without a conscience, who is highly skilled at bullshitting to both the media and the public. Sometimes the best strategy to help conceal murderers such as Tony Blair is to give them a high-profile job. This is exactly what happened a few years back to the murderer Andrei Lugovoy, who murdered whistleblower Alexander Litvinenko by poisoning him with polonium-210. He is now a highly respected politician and hero in Russia. The media seem to have forgotten about that story as well. Strangely, earlier this year, Peter Mandelson was rumoured to have been in line for a top BP job. What that lanky, manipulative waste of space knows about the oil industry is beyond me. The G-something-or-other summit was held last week, where the world's so-called economic crisis was discussed. Will somebody please tell them that the solution to the world's economic woes is very simple? It is to change the system so that money is only used for its original intention, which was to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. Period. Money should not be created out of thin air by an elite few and then loaned to governments at interest. If you remove central banks and their monopoly on creating all new money, and instead allow our governments to create their own new money, so it doesn't have to be paid back and there is no interest, this would solve the world's economic problems for good. Why haven't they thought of that, Richard, you clever shit, I hear you say? Well, it's because our governments are mere puppets of the elite who own the central banks and would kill any world leader who suggested such a solution. Don't believe me? Well, this is one of the main reasons why President Kennedy ended up like this. In the 1600s, the ruling classes used balls, chains, and whips to keep their slaves in check and do their work for them. Today, they have concocted a much better system to keep you, their slave, working 37 hours a week. That system is called the monetary system and is much more effective than balls, chains, and whips, because most slaves cannot see nor understand the mechanism that enslaves them. But I can assure you, if you work every day of your life and pay taxes, it is enslaving you. Also discussed at the G something or other summit was the axis of evil, Iran and North Korea. America stated that North Korea must be punished for the sinking of a South Korean ship, even though no evidence has been presented to suggest that it was North Korea, an act which the North Korean military vehemently denies. Also, the CIA claimed to have found evidence that Iran are enriching uranium for weapons purposes. The CIA's source is believed to have emerged from Gypsy Lee's palm reading caravan on Newcastle's town moor. It's time to introduce this week's guests onto the Starship. And this week our guests have acquired a wealth of knowledge about the UFO subject and join me today for a discussion on some of the most compelling worldwide UFO cases. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get them beamed up onto the ship. Ged Dunbar and Dale Bolton.
Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Richard.
Okay. Now we had a little discussion last year, wasn't it? 2009, down at Milton Keynes.
That's correct.
But obviously, this is a vastly improved set on the RichPlanet
Great
Starship.
view too.
Okay. Now you've come on board today to talk about convincing UFO cases throughout the decades, and we're going to start with Dale, who's going to introduce an event which happened in 1967. Do you want to take it from there, Dale?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this seems to be a little known story, but I think one that is very significant in that in 1967 in Montana, in America, there was a large missile base that controlled a whole load of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And to give you some idea of the sort of power that we were talking about and the importance of the job that the Minutemen missiles were actually doing. Mm-hmm. Each missile contained around 33 times the explosive power of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and each missile contained 3 of those warheads. Mm-hmm. And the people that were trained to proceed with the launch procedures, etc., were psychologically screened first. They weren't people that were subject to any flights of fancy. They were basically almost like human machines that were reliable.
Highly credible witnesses.
Highly credible witnesses. And at the time, they were in a bunker 60 feet below the ground on duty, basically protecting the United States from any sort of foreign attack from the Soviet Union. They received a call from the guardhouse in the capsule area where they were 60 feet underground, that there had been strange lights actually seen hovering over the main gate, mm-hmm. Which they basically didn't attach too much importance to and concentrated on focusing on their mission. Mm-hmm. Then they received a second call from a very alarmed senior guards officer saying that he had seen some sort of craft hovering above the gate and beaming a light onto different parts of the base. And at that particular point, 10 separate ICBMs shut down completely. All control over the missiles was lost. A short while after, that was at their base, but there was basically the way the American defences are laid out, there's a chain of launch stations all the way across the United States. There was a second base where a further 8 missiles were shut down. Now, these missiles are in hardened silos that are particularly protected against things like electromagnetic pulses. So when a nuclear weapon goes off, it creates so much magnetic energy. It's designed to fry electrical circuits and shut down computers and basically stop cars from working, or to help disrupt the infrastructure of a nation. So they're in hardened silos. So an ordinary advanced sort of weapon that would emit an electromagnetic pulse would not have worked. And yet at the same time, the whole lot, 18 missiles, were shut down. There was an investigation by Boeing Corporation that were responsible for the actual manufacture of the launch systems. And after a lengthy investigation, they just couldn't find what actually shut these things down. But it caused a lot of fuss because at that particular time, a significant portion of American defense systems were completely neutralized.
And Robert Salas, who was the Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander who was in that silo, he spoke at the Disclosure Project conference, I believe, and gave his account of basically
he did,
just
these
missiles
DC,
becoming inactive. And he stated that it definitely was not a power outage.
Yes.
That something had sent a signal to those missiles to disable them, basically. And there is evidence that this was covered up. You said that there was an Air Force investigation.
Well, there was an Air Force investigation, an investigation by Boeing, and the Air Force maintained that they've actually released all of the information under the Freedom of Information Act. But it seems clear that there were other pieces of information that were not released, which still remain classified, because I think that generally, even if you're not particularly worried about UFOs, but you're worried about your own domestic audience in the United States and the Soviet Union, if you can say, well, something shut down our missiles, then it doesn't necessarily send a message out of that we are a credible nation that can protect itself. So I think that there's another good reason of wanting to cover it up. But I also ask myself the question of, well, if this was some sort of extraterrestrial event or it was an alien visitation, was it because of the fact that they were aware that one of those particular missiles or multiple missiles were due to become defective or a failure in the computer system, and therefore there could be a launch that should have catastrophic consequences, so they shut the whole lot down.
Right. So they were perhaps
so it could be,
watching over us.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you think, Ged? Because there are many cases of nuclear missile launch facilities having been interfered with by UFOs.
It just seems to be that they are watching over us. It just seems like they're monitoring what's going on constantly. Like we were talking before, and we think they've been here for 1,000 years, definitely hundreds of years. The UFO sites have been going back at least 2, 3, 4 years.
Maybe we're like children playing with matches.
Yes. I think it was Dean Rose on a radio show who recently said that it was like the school teacher coming in the schoolyard, taking the weapons off the children, basically. And I think there's a guy called Bob Hastings who's actually written a book purely about nuclear missile cases involving UFOs. And we can possibly mention the Rendlesham case here, I think.
Yeah, the Rendlesham Forest case, yes.
Because that was allegedly the biggest storage area of nuclear missiles in Europe at that time, in 1980. So it appears that they have a great interest in nuclear missile sites. So you would think that they're just keeping an eye to stop us from... I mean, is that for their benefit or our benefit?
If you take the view of the fact that we are effectively like a project where they're watching over us to see how we develop whether we develop to higher levels of consciousness and a better understanding of our place in the universe and science and things like this, then as we develop, there are going to be dangers, just in the same way as your child grows. It comes in contact with dangers.
Yes.
And rather than frighten the child, you try to prevent the danger from occurring in the first place by the least amount of intervention. On the other hand, it could be that they're attracted to these nuclear silos and nuclear bases because the fact that there would be a continuous stream of radioactive energy being emitted as a result of the highly enriched uranium and plutonium. So it could be that they're almost like a radio source, and the frequency of that radio source attracts them in some way. But that doesn't explain why they're shut down.
Keeping their eye on what's going on, really.
Keeping their eye on what's going on.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think we're very dangerous with the toys that we've got.
Basically animals.
I mean, it could be that a nuclear weapon, I mean, we've only set off relatively small nuclear weapons so far. Perhaps the bigger ones can puncture holes in the fabric of space-time, and they know this, maybe. They're more destructive to the fabric of nature than we realise, maybe. And maybe they know that. But there are a few other factors in that particular case. One was actually sighted directly over the, where the nuclear missile was, and there was never a technical resolution to the cause of the shutdown.
No, they would never find out what exactly went wrong.
So no engineer could analyse the system and find any fault after these systems. So it was as if they sent a signal, which the specifically correct signal to shut that control panel or whatever it is.
I would imagine that, if you're the President of the United States and somebody rings you and says, we've lost control of 18 of our Minuteman missiles, each with 3 major warheads on, 33 times more powerful than the ones we dropped on Hiroshima, you'd be a bit concerned, and you'd have a very thorough investigation.
You would.
And if it was possible to arrive at a conclusion, you would do.
Okay. And when the security patrol went out to see the UFO, he lost contact on his radio.
Yes.
And this, as we'll see, seems to be a recurring theme. On UFO sightings. As soon as someone gets near to it, no electronic communication seems to work. Okay. And I've got a quote here from Robert Salas, who was the man in the missile silo. He said that the Air Force has clearly and deliberately hidden the fact that a large number of Air Force personnel reported UFO sighting at the time of our strategic missiles became unaccountably disabled. Okay, and just to mention that the other American Air Force bases which have had similar incidents are South Dakota in 1966 and 92, Wyoming, Walker Air Force Base, and we mentioned Rendlesham Forest. Okay, so I mean, what else can we say about this particular case, Ged? I mean, does it concern you, or?
I'm quite happy to say that they are looking over us, and that I don't think you should be worried about the aliens coming down, disclosure, because I think they've been here for so many years,
right?
Thousands of years, hundreds of years, that there's not a problem.
I mean, I heard that. Actually, you can read this. There was a House of Lords debate in 1979 where one of the Lords said that Russia and America signed a secret pact in 1973 to share UFO information so that neither side thought that the UFO was Russia or American, to basically prevent them pressing the nuclear button. So clearly, and I have heard that Kennedy wanted to share the UFO information with the Russians as well, because he wanted to go into space with them. A joint space program, but
the Russians had a very extensive UFO monitoring program under Brezhnev anyway that was kept, very secret
again.
Where there was, various, traces left where UFOs had actually landed, and there was still patterns of radiation there. Sometime later, there was a large UFO that was actually seen over Moscow, by large numbers of the military, and people were actually briefed. They took it seriously as something that they could use rather than something that they could ridicule. So they actually took a more positive view of the UFO subject, and wanted as many reports as possible to come in.
I mean, speaking from an engineer's perspective, to have the technology to be able to beam whatever they beamed into that silo, to give it the correct signal to shut it down rather than launch it, for example, they would have had to have understood the binary code, They would have to understand the software. They would have to understand the relays, the whole gambit. They'd need knowledge of, but not only need knowledge of it, they'd need to know how to send the right signal in to override it.
Yeah,
I mean,
which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it's almost as if they've done it from within. You know,
Right. But probably with the computing power that we've got today in a small laptop computer, taking it back to 1967. The laptop computer today with the right software would probably be able to read all the launch codes and everything that was built into it and shut it down relatively easily.
Yeah.
So if we've got somebody who has that sort of technology but way ahead,
Thousands of years,
then
it's not a
maybe
problem.
you can actually sense all of that information remotely, and maybe this information is being transmitted in the terms of photons that carry the information in the form of light.
I mean, you would assume then that they would have certain personnel who are experts on Earth-based technology. Do you see?
Well, the aliens could be reading the human beings' minds, couldn't they? Which
Right.
is,
Or perhaps they've got a copy of the manual from somewhere.
well,
Well, when you think about it, I mean, we've been broadcasting now since the early 1930s, haven't we? Since the very first transmissions of television and radio have been, going now for well over 100 years. And of course, those have been emanating out into space to be monitored by anyone. So, therefore, even information that is encrypted, maybe for a society that is more technically advanced, the ability to read that encrypted information that's being transmitted from one satellite station to another one, or one military station to another one, all of the information is there. The problem is that for the average human, he can't actually go and decipher that information, but for somebody with more advanced technology, it's probably very simple to.
Okay. All right then, chaps. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, and we're going to be discussing further cases after this.
The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories. The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome back on board the Starship, and we are talking with Dale Bolton and Ged Dunbar, who are UFO researchers. And Jed's going to introduce the next UFO case, which involves a Boeing 747.
that's correct. Japanese Airlines 1628 flight
Okay.
from Paris to Tokyo, flying over Alaska. We've got a clip on there on the
Okay, we'll
monitor.
just take a...
The Boeing 747 cargo jet is on a routine flight from Paris to Tokyo, cruising at 600 miles per hour at an altitude of 35,000 feet. It heads towards Anchorage, Alaska to refuel. Suddenly, at 5:11 p.m., Captain Kenju Terauchi, a pilot with 29 years flight experience, sees three large, fast-moving, unidentified objects 2,000 feet below them. The largest object is described by Captain Terauchi as resembling, quote, a shelled walnut. Captain Terauchi describes the main craft as being twice the size of an American aircraft carrier. After several minutes of observing the UFO, the pilots realize the objects are now matching their speed, 600 miles per hour, tracking them. The captain reports that the objects begin, quote, making moves that are impossible for any man-made aircraft to perform. Then, without warning, two of the smaller craft suddenly rise and shoot directly in front of the pilot's window. The objects come so close to the airplane that Captain Terauchi says the intense glow makes his face feel warm.
All of a sudden they appear and they're traveling right in front of the aircraft. And they were sort of wobbling back and forth as they moved.
At that very moment, the radio link to Anchorage goes dead, leaving the aircraft flying blind. A horrifying catastrophe is seconds away, but the UFOs rise and veer left. To this day, the case remains a mystery.
The Japan Airlines 747 had a saucer go around it. The papers mysteriously disappeared from the FAA office.
Right, so there we go.
That's an excellent case, like I say.
It's very compelling evidence.
Yeah. It was a cargo plane, 747. Like I said, the captain had 29 years experience. The aircraft was flying at 600 knots across Alaska. It was going down to refuel in Alaska. It actually was, the air traffic control picked up the large mothership with two smaller ships with it, and the size of the mothership was the size of two aircraft carriers.
Right. And I think in that clip that we saw, it doesn't show the scale really.
No, there's no scale there at all.
It's two aircraft
carriers.
It's
absolutely
huge.
It's enormous.
It's enormous.
Yeah.
And just hovering in front of the 747 as it's flying, and it was tracking the 747 approximately 400 miles. Which is,
and again, highly credible witnesses.
actually, a week after the 747 had gone on the route, a commercial, not a commercial, a military plane spotted the same UFO, and it was also picked up on radar.
Also, I mean, this series of small UFOs, I think, were picked up. They weren't initially picked up by the ground radar in Anchorage, Alaska, but they were actually picked up 13 kilometers away on the aircraft's radar, weren't they?
Yes, that's correct.
And then eventually they were picked up by the ground. But there seems to be also quite a collection of different designs of UFOs, in that they suggested that one was almost an oblong shape where there was a series of tubes that appeared to control attitude and thrust, but yet there seemed to be a section in the center that was completely transparent. So the whole thing was effectively being held together by almost transparent connections.
Is this the mothership or one of the
this
pilots?
This is one of the initial drone ships.
Yeah,
before the mothership became
two drone ships.
So if you can imagine like a selection of organ pipes going left and right, and they suggest, the pilots believed that these pipes were being used for some form of directional control, but it could have been some other reason. But certainly I've never heard of any UFO described in that way, as just a series of tubes, but unconnected in the centre, where you'd expect a fuselage to be in the centre, like in the centre of an aircraft. I mean, there was nothing at all.
After the aircraft landed, the pilot was debriefed, and I believe you'd have to check on it, but he didn't fly for 18 months after that.
He was given a desk job, because I get whether they believed him or not. But
well,
I mean,
them hot air balloons, you
picked up
can
on
travel at
radar
600 knots.
Exactly.
But it was also just a duration of this thing. It wasn't like a 2 minute and it's over and done with. And I believe that he tried taking photographs. He had a camera with him and tried taking photographs. But every time he aimed it at any of these flying objects, the shutter couldn't focus. It was constantly tripping in and out. The autofocus was constantly trying to focus on it. It couldn't. He put it into manual mode, and then a light shone on the aircraft, and the aircraft began to vibrate. And again, that prevented the photograph from being taken. But I don't know how the aliens would actually know the relevance of a photograph being taken, or whether or not they have some means of looking straight through the fuselage.
They're scanning the aircraft.
Yes, they're scanning it in some way.
So definitely an alien craft then.
Definitely.
Not one of ours.
Not one of ours,
back
definitely.
engineer.
Certainly a very strange design.
Yeah. I mean, it's the walnut shape. I mean, pilots try to explain these things in conventional thrust-based aircraft technology, don't they? They say, well, there was no wing, so how can it stay off the ground? There was no thrust, etc. But they're overlooking the fact that these things are probably propelled using an anti-gravity type propulsion system, which seems to, and in this case it's the same again. Once the craft came close to the aircraft, its radio communication was lost, which suggests...
This is why we're very interested in it, because we want to get about the technology, and that's why we're studying the cases, because the technology is there. We do believe the American government has the technology, and that's why we want it to be released.
And we will come on to one case in particular where we believe they've recovered UFOs. A UFO.
But I think there must be a lot of ordinary people out there, just like us, that are interested in the subject, that may know someone who's told them something, or has heard from someone that certainly I'd like to hear about. You know what I mean? That if people, there's plenty of ordinary people out there who may think that their knowledge is insignificant, but it's actually very important, and maybe just the piece of the jigsaw that's missing to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of video footage sent to me, and I get a lot of sort of reports that people will write, I saw a UFO 5 years ago, and they'll give me a verbal description of it. But in many cases, the whistleblower testimony is the best, I believe, because the video is generally low quality. And we were talking about that earlier, about how
Yeah, it's very hard to get video
it's
quality.
very hard to film. If I say to you, Dale, you film that street light, which is half a mile away, with a bog standard video camera,
It's not
Yeah.
possible.
You
without
won't be able to do it.
tripod
You can't
and
hold
going
it
on to
still
manual,
enough,
is
no.
it?
you need a tripod, and you need a manual exposure
Yeah.
to reduce the exposure in order to focus
Sure.
on it. So this is, I mean, it sounds like an excuse, but this is one of the reasons why there's not good UFO footage. Well, not a lot of good UFO footage. There is some, which we are going to look at in one of the other cases. But again, we've got all of these common characteristics. We've got the phenomenal acceleration, which, if performed by conventional craft,
It's
would
not
kill the
possible,
occupants.
Yes.
We've got the loss of radio communications. We've got the massive size, which, you know, if we were to put an aircraft carrier in space, it would just fall to the ground. So you say, well, how is it being kept off the ground? So in summary, what can we say about this case of 1986? I mean, is this one of the best cases, would you say, Jan?
It's up there with the rest of them, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's another undisputable.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure people can write in and ring in and tell. But
I mean, what is a pilot of that experience flying, you know, cargo? What has he got to be gained? You know, I mean, he clearly doesn't need, you know, the sort of bad publicity, effectively, that would come, and the effects on his career by revealing such a thing, and to provide those sort of details, and for it to be supported by both ground and radar evidence from the aircraft itself.
And if we just look at the fact that these UFOs kept pace with this
Exactly, yeah.
747 for
they
quite a
actually
long
tracked
time.
it for
Yeah.
400 miles from behind, and then they hovered in front of it. You can imagine a 747 flying through at 600
Yeah.
knots, and the massive mothership in front. It must have been unbelievable.
Yeah.
wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
You just couldn't even believe it, could you?
I mean, there are so many other similar cases as well. I mean, we've got the Ray Bowyer case, which happened in the English Channel,
Yeah.
which is slightly similar to that.
Yeah, another aircraft.
And I mean, what do you think their purpose is in doing that? The ETs, if we presume it's ET.
I've been thinking, what you know, they got this 747. There's only 3 people on board. Such a large aircraft. They must have been tracking it. I'm wondering why.
I mean, but if they're, as we discussed in the previous item, so advanced, why do they need to just pick on? I mean, there are thousands of 747 flights every day, I guess. So what's...
Yeah, but
why are they honing in on
over
one-
Alaska, I mean, you've got airspace there that is where they could appear without drawing a lot of attention to themselves, and also obviously over Alaska, the weather conditions are such that it does make actually tracking things by radar a little intermittent. So you've got the sparseness of population. But, I mean, I've not heard of any UFOs particularly being seen over desert regions, but yet you would think that would be the case because of the fact that it's sparsely populated and it's an easy place for it to come down.
Well, there are over the deserts, aren't there? There's always over.
And there are cases
Las
where
Vegas.
entire aircraft have actually disappeared in cases like this.
Yes.
They've got the
Or
military...
flights of aircraft.
Yeah, the military they've seen an object on the radar next to a known flight, and then they both disappear.
Yeah.
And there's no crash damage or anything.
No.
And there are many cases of that if you look at Timothy Good's books, which
It's actually covered in Timothy Good, that case as well, isn't it? In Timothy's.
yes,
his
that's
books.
right. Need to know.
Need
I
to
think it's
know.
called. Yeah. Okay then, chaps. Well, we're going to talk some more after the break, and in particular, we're going to cover the Stevensville, Texas case from 2008, which was another, what I would call, extremely watertight case, which proves the existence of UFOs. But before that, we're going to feature our Artist of the Week.
Well, I'm just taking the dog out. It's a bit late to be going over the woods now, isn't it, son? It's all right. It's not like I'm going to get abducted or anything.
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession.
is a small group of people all over the world who are awakening, who are beginning to understand that they've been living their life.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society. The very word secrecy is repugnant. The very word secrecy is repugnant.
Tuesday, Wednesday, every day turns out to be the same way. Still got these things running in my brain. I wish I never done cocaine. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, every day turns out to be the same way. Still got these things running in my brain. I wish I never done cocaine. The sort of things that make you go insane. The sort of things that make you look out of place. You're the odd one out. You really think we're the only ones that are living in space. Being left to the dark, being left all alone, being left in your home, being left out to know, being left to the dark, being left all alone, being left in your home, being left. I mean, come on, know if it's right that people know about this fabled slide show. I'm the one who's sitting in front row. I'm the one who tell all about you. All the stuff that your secret people hide. All the truth's being kept from our needing eyes. I hope soon people will realise that we've been living in loads of lies. Stuff that I've seen, it gets worse than an extraterrestrial being. It gets worse than a UFO chasing me. It gets worse than an alien abductee. Non-terrestrial officer. NASA, you if you would like to research Gary McKinnon, you will find that they're saying he's the world's worst hacker. Some could be fact, some could be science fiction. Undeniable truth or false. Goddamn, this shit's an addiction. Whether you believe me or not, I don't care. It's your time that's wasting on the clock. Did you know there's structures on the moon and a UFO in a crater that got stuck? No one has to know the truth, you might as well just be saying the end of your life. With all this crazy shit that's going on, all these sly people, they let walk by. They're watching us here day and night. They control their life and they ain't right. They're living on day-to-day life. All the stuff that I've seen, it gets worse than an extraterrestrial being. It gets worse than a UFO chasing me. It gets worse than an alien abductee. Non-terrestrial found out searching all these years with your pain, heartbreak and paranoid fears. So it's sitting there right on top of your minds about the only thing you talk about all the time. Being left in the dark, being left all alone.
The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories. The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
We're talking with Dale Bolton and Ged Dunbar, who are UFO researchers, and I'm going to introduce the next case, which took place fairly recently in 2008, a place called Stevensville in Texas. Now, this particular object was picked up on 5 separate radar sites, and some guys at MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network, the UFO organization in America, they've compiled this 76-page document where they've submitted Freedom of Information requests to the Air Force, and they were given a vast amount of radar data from these 5 different radar sites. And I guess perhaps the military didn't expect them to actually analyze and tabulate all of the radar data. And they also got 17 witness reports as well. They used 8 of these witness accounts because 8 of the accounts were able to identify the time and the direction of the object. And essentially what they did was they've drawn a 100-mile by 140-mile sort of cube. It wouldn't be a cube, but if you know what I mean, up to 30-odd thousand feet.
And fill all the data.
And they've plotted all of the data in that particular airspace. And there are 2 phenomenal graphs which come out of that. And the first is that you've got an object. Obviously, the radar data can't determine the exact size of the object, but it's been estimated from the witness accounts. But the object, when you look at its dynamics from the radar report, it basically was on the radar for 1 hour and 10 minutes. and at 3 minutes past 7, it was just passing along at about 40 odd miles per hour in a fixed direction, and then it just completely disappeared from the radar for 7 minutes, and then reappeared as if it had been going in a straight path. Okay, so it went completely invisible, and then at another point, about 20 minutes later, it accelerated to 532 miles per hour in 30 seconds, and then it decelerated to 40 miles per hour 10 seconds later. Now, if you compare the two speeds of 500 and odd miles per hour to 49 miles per hour, there's no aircraft that can do that. Because if you either have a fast-moving aircraft like a jet,
it'd be dropping out of the sky.
Yeah. Perhaps a Harrier or something like that could do that, but they wouldn't be able to sustain the slow speed for very long. Yeah. And this thing was tracked for well over an hour. So, and the other thing, it actually speeds up to 1900 miles per hour, where it appears there's one with radar return, it's miles out of the way. So the dynamics of it are phenomenal, basically. And it didn't have a transponder fitted, which suggests that it wasn't a known aircraft. And we can go further in the fact that the witnesses' accounts, they've all been sort of compiled together, and they all basically correlate with each other. You've got 8 witnesses, I think, at various different points along the path of this unknown object, and they've actually accounted for the fact that people have a tendency to exaggerate the size of UFOs, and they believe it to be approximately 1,000 feet in size, which is similar to the case that we discussed, two aircraft carriers. It's probably the size of a large sports stadium. Yeah, that's the kind of size, you know, we're talking about. But what I found interesting about this case is that there are in that 100 by 140 mile sort of piece of airspace, there were lots of commercial airliners who would just so happen to be, you know, landing or taking off, and there was a lot of military activity. But the military activity, it didn't suggest that it was pursuing this object, because you had the object coming along here and the military just doing that. It was as if they were in the air and they were aware of it, perhaps. And there's also, they believe, they haven't concluded, you know, absolutely, but they believe that there was a craft, very high altitude, just basically circling the whole area throughout the whole time, and they believe that was an AWACS craft. That will have had its own radar, which hasn't been released. So, again, another massive object.
But one of theirs or one of ours?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. I would say it's one of theirs. That would be my guess, because have we got the technology to completely disappear a 1,000-foot wide object in the air?
Well, yes. It depends on whether you term it as physically disappear, in other words, to truly become invisible or dematerialize, or make invisible on radar, because a stealth can do that instantly just by effectively switching on the stealth system, and as the system comes in, it disappears from the radar reflection. So, yes, you can make it disappear, but the acceleration and deceleration, that's a little harder to explain.
And there's a lot of witnesses on this one, isn't there? Police officers actually videoed it, and I think they actually had the camera, didn't they, for the speed? Yeah. See, that's how they track one of the speeds.
Yeah, and I think there was another thing where they actually got a specialist in who does work on calculating how accidents happen by reconstructing them in 3D.
All this case,
and they actually fired lasers at all the different positions and formed an opinion as to what this thing was like. And it was effectively a huge black triangle.
Right.
And that was mathematically calculated from all the different reports and the angles that the thing was actually seen at, and you know, it was quite an expensive study done to determine you know, exactly what this thing was like.
And there are many UFO cases which involve black triangles.
Yeah, 70% of them are, aren't they?
Yeah. Okay. Although they're fairly new, you know.
Yeah, the 1990s there was cases in Belgium and in the UK, in Derby.
The one in Belgium was quite famous one,
being escorted, wasn't there? The one that was going to Holy Loch from Belgium, that was being escorted by 2 F-14s, I think it was, or other swing-wing jets. Because I remember seeing it in one of the newspapers, and there was this picture of this black triangle with 2 fighter jets either side. So if they are theirs, then why are we escorting them?
I mean, it does tie in with a case that David Caton looked into. I've covered that in one of my programs. This was over, I'm trying to think if it was like the Manchester area, and basically a pilot saw a triangular shadow, which was again very large shadow, underflying them, but he couldn't see the craft. But he saw this solid triangle shadow, and a few weeks after that, there was some guys on a microlight. Exactly the same happened to them, but the black triangle was going the other way, and again they couldn't see the craft. And within that area, people on the road had witnessed a black flying triangle. And I did ask David Caton, you know, could it not be one of ours, a secret military craft, the TR-3B, and he just said, no, there's no way that's one of ours.
Because of the manoeuvres it's made.
Because of the manoeuvres and the fact that it's completely invisible.
Well, the Belgium case is the same.
So they've got the ability to bend light, in other words, in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I did say to David, well, if you were standing in the field where the shadow was, does that mean that you would have been able to see it, even though the person in the plane couldn't?
But then there's new battle technologies that are pretty much almost in theatre now, where tanks have effectively thousands of miniature television screens, LCD screens, high definition LCD screens, that are part of the armour, and they can stop them, and effectively the cameras on the other side of the tank take a picture and project it on this side of the tank, and when you put it against the background, the whole lot becomes completely invisible and seamless. It would still cast a shadow, but you actually cannot see it physically with your eyes.
Okay. Well, I mean, so this was triangular craft, 1,000 feet. How is it being kept off the ground? Did I not? I'm sure I heard that there were these sort of circles or ovals, lots of them underneath the craft, that were possibly some kind of propulsion system or inertial shielding or something like that to cancel out the gravity, perhaps.
Although, as I say, there was talk of a stealth balloon project, which you know, some people took seriously and other people didn't. But you know, why you would want to have a black stealth balloon of those dimensions, and how you'd actually get it to move fast and slow down is, you know, we all know balloons tend to sort of float along quite slowly.
And they don't travel at 500 knots.
No, exactly.
This case is a little different in that the military seemed to know what was going on, and I have read that it was heading towards George Bush's Texas, you know, place, house, wherever he lives.
In fact, it covered a lot of military bases, didn't it? It went round in virtually half an hour, didn't it?
So maybe, you know, maybe it is one of theirs. It's just that our military know more about it now than they did in 1942 or 1948, as the cases that we're going to discuss.
Or maybe it's been, you know, captured and they've been taking all this time to figure out how to fly it. And now they're doing test flights, but they only tell certain levels of the military that need to know, you know, that the mission is actually on. Yeah.
One thing that really frustrates me about cases like this one is people say to you things like, yeah, you believe in UFOs, Richard, but we've never had that Independence Day type solid evidence, have we? And I say to them, yeah, we have. It was in Stevensville, Texas in 2008, because if you took this report and you create a BBC News at 10 item out of that report,
the people would believe it was on the BBC.
With a proper reconstruction of the craft and put it on as the main news item, that would be it. That would be disclosure.
Correct.
Or acknowledgement, but it's never done. It's always watered
So the question
down.
is, why are they hiding the information?
And we're probably going to go into that in the next program, because there are competing theories as to why. I mean, you say hiding it. We are aware of a lot of this information. Obviously,
it is
not
trying to be
all
covered
of
up, though, isn't it?
Sorry,
it is trying to be covered up.
Oh, yes, absolutely, or explained away. I mean, they can't cover it all up. People use the word disclosure, but I would use the word an acknowledgement. That's all, because I think disclosure suggests we want you to tell us all of your secrets, whereas an acknowledgement just suggests, well, we want you to acknowledge that what we already know is correct. And that would perhaps be a stepping stone towards disclosure.
But once you acknowledge something, then you've let the genie out of the bottle. And you know, once you said, well, yes, what you saw existed,
admit it,
there's no going back. And all governments, at the end of the day, are frightened of their people, because the people are the real power. Sometimes they forget this. And I think that, you know, that the government often, look at their people and say, well, you know, do you really need to know this? You know, all that you need to know is everything will be all right. Just leave it to us.
Keep watching the football.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And you know, if there's any bad news, we won't give it to you all in one go. Yeah. We'll give you the bad news, but we'll spread it out over several weeks, and you'll feel better about it then.
Yeah. It is frustrating that our supposed democratic governments are so nanny-ish with the information, thinking that they have to protect us all the time.
Well, I still think that many of the governments think that, you know, we're the same people in the 16th century that, you know, we'd do something extreme. If they said that UFOs or paranormal existed, you know, we'd go out burning people in the streets and,
basically what,
you know, run amok.
Basically what Dale said is correct, is once you admit to one, then the cat's out of the bag and they've got to run.
Well, the public then have a right to demand.
Of further information.
Correct, it's like a domino effect.
You know, and if you can demand that, well, okay, well, what's at Area 51? Well, how long have you had it? And can I take a ride in it?
Can we have the technology?
And after all, I own it.
Why didn't you tell us at first?
Yeah, so, you know, it gets...
It's easier for them to just draw a curtain
but we do know
and deny everything rather than admit to one thing.
We do know the information will come out. It may be 5 years, it may be 10, maybe 15.
But I think it's mostly on a need-to-know basis. I think that certainly most of these secret technologies tend to come out more through conflicts in other parts of the world. That's where they're allowed to be seen openly as opposed to covertly.
Yeah. Yeah, I often think that it might come out by accident or via a route that they hadn't thought of. But anyway, that's all we've got time for in this particular programme, but we are going to do another programme and cover some further cases. So thanks, Ged, and thanks, Dale. We'll get you beamed back down to planet Earth. And it just remains for me to say, keep your eyes on the skies, your feet on the ground, and tell all your friends about this show.
The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories. The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. It's time to introduce this week's guests. And discussing some more convincing UFO cases, this week's guests join me on the Starship for a second appearance. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get them beamed up onto the ship. Welcome, chaps.
Good evening.
Oh, it's nice to be back.
Welcome, Dale. Welcome, Ged. Okay, now we discussed three cases, very convincing cases, I believe, in the last show, and we're going to discuss three more today. And we're going to start things off with a helicopter case, which Ged is going to tell us about.
Excellent case from 1973, 4 military people on board. It was also witnessed by 5 civilians. The helicopter was over America, travelling at about 3,700 feet. Came across an orange light glowing in the sky. The orange light came up to the helicopter. The helicopter had to swerve into the left, and it put it into a dive from 3,700 feet to about 1,700 feet. From the UFO, out came a green light. This is from the captain's records of it, and it dragged the helicopter back up. And the guy said it seemed to scan all the aircraft.
Okay.
After that, it scanned it, let it go. The aircraft came back, landed. It's all actually on radar. All if you can go on, you can see for yourself and Google it, and you'll find out what's gone on. Okay. It's a fascinating case.
Okay. And we have got a short clip which we'll just play now.
To jog your memories.
One of the most thoroughly investigated cases in Dr. Haynes' file involves the near collision of a UFO with a United States Army helicopter piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Coyne and his crew. While flying over Mansfield, Ohio, at 11 p.m. on October 18, 1973, they observed a bright red object which paralleled their craft and then rapidly moved toward them on a collision course.
I looked out the window and observed this light moving at a very excessive speed, in excess of 600 knots, coming at the helicopter. It looked like a locked-on missile.
A family of 5 in a car observed the strange red object on a collision course with Colonel Coyne's helicopter. They pulled off the road to watch.
The thing that makes this particular evening a unique experience was that it was almost a mid-air collision with an object that we, or you know, as a UFO. We did not know it was such until it was on top of the helicopter, and that took just a matter of minutes.
Colonel Coyne put the helicopter into a dive to try to avoid impact. When he and his crew looked up, the object was keeping pace with them.
While it was in this position, the green light came out from the undercarriage of the UFO.
Colonel Coyne cut the power and set the controls for a steep dive. In spite of this, the helicopter was pulled upward toward the UFO from an altitude of 1,700 feet to an altitude of above 3,700 feet. Colonel Coyne and his crew observed the strange UFO at close range for approximately 2 minutes.
The object that I viewed that particular evening had a high degree of technology. It was composed of a structure and a design that we do not have. The object can move through the atmosphere without causing any turbulence. It can move at high speeds below 10,000 feet. There are no vertical or horizontal stabilizers, no landing gear, no source of propulsion reflected on the craft. Looks like it could fly in space.
It seems like a very convincing case, yet another very reliable, highly credible witness, Ged. I mean, and some similarities with other cases as well.
That's correct, yeah. Like I said, there was also 5 civilians on the ground watching them from the car, so you've got the air traffic control, the radar, you've got the captains.
Plus the magnetic compass on the aircraft was affected and never worked properly again after that.
Yeah, the aircraft was taken out of commission after a couple of years because all the electrics was not good on the aircraft.
Really. So again, we've got electromagnetic effects coming in, which we've seen on previous cases. And did this helicopter pilot have any problem maintaining his license, as we've seen in other cases? Do you know?
No, he's actually on YouTube. If you go on YouTube, he actually discusses it. It's actually
I think he was in the Medical Air Corps at the time, wasn't he?
Right.
The pilot.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of size was this object?
He didn't really say. Because he said he could feel the heat coming through the screen, which is the same as the 747 one. And I think they just wanted to get out of the way quickly.
Right.
But what's most fascinating is this green beam and dragging them back up. And they had this idea that they were being scanned by the UFO.
Okay. So possibly, again, anti-gravity technology, which
being used again, yes.
Which would perhaps raise this helicopter.
Yeah, which all the flight data is there to be analysed, so all the information's there, and it's another excellent case.
Okay.
Which can't be disputed.
All right. Well, let's move on to another case from quite an early case, 1942, which took place during the Second World War in Los Angeles, and I think Dale's going to tell us a little bit about this case.
Well, this was only a short while after Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese. So obviously America was on pretty much high alert, and so was, all the different American bases in that area. And this was an unidentified object that was seen by literally thousands of people and the news networks over Los Angeles. And not only was it seen, the military were told to basically shoot it down, and they actually fired over 2,000 shells in a period of about 45 minutes at this object. And a number of people were injured, and I believe actually a couple were actually killed by shells that had actually sort of missed the object and gone down. But yet at the same time, they didn't do anything at all to actually disable this object. And afterwards, the military's official view was that because America had recently been attacked, the military was on a heightened state of alert and massively overreacted to what they thought they saw. So they actually fired 2,000 shells at what they thought they saw and kept it in the searchlights. And I believe you may have a small bit of footage on it, actually showing this, because it was big news at the time.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area, ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified objects moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Searchlights closely followed the object down the coast and kept it centered in their track. Shells frequently could be seen bursting near the object, but none appeared to hit it. The shooting stopped about 3:30 a.m. Approximately 20 minutes after the firing died down, the ship returned and headed westward from Long Beach toward Santa Monica. The guns went into action again, throwing round after round of shells at the object. The second barrage appeared to be closer to downtown Los Angeles, since watchers could hear the concussion of the guns more clearly, and the flash of bursting shells was brighter. Then the ship disappeared for the second time over the ocean. We return you now to CBS in New York.
Yeah, and we can see from the footage that the craft, whatever it may be, is certainly, it doesn't look like a conventional aircraft. It has a classic disc shape, and I think in the newspaper reports they referred to it as unknown aircraft or something
They
like
tried to
that.
put it down for as a weapon.
And you know, I mean, you know, I know that the Japanese were experimenting at that time with literally balloons made of rice paper, attaching bombs to them and sending them in the prevailing winds over to America. But you would think with 2,000 shells being fired at it by these people that were on high alert, that had obviously been training a lot, they'd actually be able to knock something down like that. But clearly, with all of their anti-aircraft fire at this this device that was in the air, and the fact that they kept it in the spotlights and it was there long enough and seen by enough people, I'm basically baffled as an explanation as to how that can just be written off as hysteria on behalf of the military.
Yeah, and it's gone down as the biggest mass sighting in history.
Yes.
And one interesting quote I read from one of the people who actually witnessed it, they said, it was a lovely pale orange, about the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. So we've had that reported in other UFO cases, just very bright orange glowing light. And as you say, people actually died because the shells were bouncing off this object.
But they couldn't bring anything down, nothing ever came down the day.
Yeah, nothing came down. And
so again, it may have had some form of magnetic shield that was acting as a repellent to the shells that were being fired at it.
And at the end, after over half an hour of shelling, it just sort of slowly made its way
moved away,
out of sight. Okay. I mean, it's incredible, really. But it looks as though the media were censored to some degree because they didn't go around witnesses getting detailed, accurate accounts of what this UFO actually looked like. They referred to it as some anomalous aircraft. So can we take it from that the cover-up was in place in 1942?
The cover-up's been in place for well over 100 years.
Yeah, I think that certainly, you know, during the war there are unusual and probably unnecessary levels of national security applied. You know, in the same way that you know, thousands of loyal American Japanese were interned and put in prison camps, and yet there'd been no evidence against them at all, which was an overreaction. So I think that certainly having something over American soil that they can't shoot down, it's you know, it's going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable about defending your own people against the Japanese attack, isn't it?
There was even recorded evidence of 6 UFOs over the Washington DC, wasn't there?
Yes, there was that famous one, and two yes, in consecutive nights, wasn't there?
Well, I did read in Timothy Good's book that this case there was more than one craft Am I right? Or did you?
Well, I think the craft had been seen in two places by two different people. One was over Culver City,
right,
and then the next one was actually over central LA, and that's where the big guns.
That's where you see the
fire.
spotlights on the aircraft.
Yes,
it can just make out it's a dish.
So I'm not sure whether there was actually two or more ships, but certainly. It seems pretty clear, even in 1932 footage, 1942 footage, that they're actually firing at something. And with that many guns, you'd think they'd be able to bring it down.
Yeah, and there was a case in 1941, Missouri, I think, where a craft came down and there were allegedly alien bodies in that particular case. But again, the air intelligence or whoever they were, they took people aside who'd seen it and they warned them that they're not to speak of it. So it suggests that the cover-up was going on possibly even in the 1930s.
Well, and long before Roswell and these sort of things that people know about.
Yeah, it was just that the bolts were screwed down tighter when Roswell came about.
And also the intelligence services really came into their own in the late 1930s and 1940s, where there was various new parts of military intelligence actually put together.
Yeah.
And these had independent power from the normal Federal Bureau of Investigations. The CIA was still a little bit in its infancy. So yes, I think there was a lot of different departments, Department of the Navy, Naval Intelligence, and all of them had their own private agendas.
Okay, I mean, it's incredible how they can manipulate the media and cover things up in this way. Do you think it's down to as much embarrassment over the fact that this object's just sat there and they fired 2,000 shells at it, so they can't protect the public if it was hostile, that they just think, well, we can't have the public thinking that the military
I don't
is not
think,
the most
I definitely
powerful.
think that they just don't want disclosure of the UFOs.
Right.
They're covering it up for their own agenda.
Okay.
And that's the reason why it's not embarrassment at all.
Okay.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because I mean the idea of Project Blue Book was to explain away what these UFOs were. Now, also, I mean UFOs are quite useful in misdirecting public attention away from what their true purpose is. That I mean the CIA have more or less come right out and said that. As far as the UFO concept is concerned, it's a great cover-all. Yeah. That we'll once we've got people seeing UFOs, then we can pass all sorts of things off as UFO phenomenon, and that covers up the true purpose of what was actually going on. Basically as a sideshow.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, we'll go for a short break and we'll discuss another case after this.
The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories. The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome back on board the Starship, and we are talking with UFO researchers Dale Bolton and Ged Dunbar. Now, we're going to discuss next a case from 1948, which I'm going to introduce. Now, this happened in New Mexico in a place called Aztec on the 25th of March, 1948 at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I'll describe what happened before I actually describe the various witnesses involved, because the story about what happened has been put together from all of these witnesses, which are very reliable. A 100-foot diameter disc came down in the desert, and basically this disc was a kind of an aluminium-like substance, but when they actually did tests on this substance, they heated it to 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit and it was unaffected, and they couldn't cut through it with diamond-tipped blades. So it was extremely strong material. And the disc was actually found to contain 16 dead alien bodies, which ranged in height from, I believe it was 36 inches to 42 inches. So they were very small beings. And the craft obviously was taken away by the military. And now there are various witnesses who have come forward over the years with this particular case. A chap called Scott Ramsey has uncovered 2 or 3 witnesses and interviewed them before they passed away. And one of them actually was working to control fires in the region, bushfires. And he stumbled across the site and basically he witnessed, he could see through a window in the craft there was 2 aliens actually slumped over a control panel, and another witness actually walked on top of the craft before the military actually took it away. And all of the witnesses report that there were no rivets, there were no seams, there were no joints. It was just one contiguous piece of metal. And allegedly when the military got there, they couldn't figure out how to get inside the thing because obviously the metal was so tough. But there was one hole in one of the portholes which they managed to make wider. And they then apparently they put a pole through that porthole and managed to press a button which opened a secret door, and they were able to get inside. I mean, it sounds like such a science fiction scenario, but all of this information is backed up by the witnesses, some of them from military intelligence. And one guy who was interviewed, he said that when they took the craft apart, it was made up of these segments, almost like an oriental puzzle, because there was no rivets or anything keeping it together. Like you had to push the actual metal components in a particular sequence in order to get them to fit together. Yeah. So it was an extremely sophisticated method of assembly to make this particular craft. And there are witnesses who said that these bodies were charred, which indicated that perhaps the hole in the craft is what caused all of the occupants to die, albeit that the craft's automatic landing system landed the craft perfectly safely because it was entirely intact when it was picked up by the military. So similar to other UFO cases, and one researcher who wrote a book about this particular case, they call him Frank Scully. He wrote a book called Behind the Flying Saucers. This was written in 1950.
This isn't the guy from X-Files, is it?
No, not the Scully from X-Files. This book in 1950 claimed that there had been 4 UFO retrievals in 1950, not including Roswell. So that's 5 by 1950, and this was 1 year after Roswell.
And these are the aircraft we think, well, they're being back-engineered.
Yes.
Well, it was also taught they were actually being deliberately brought down with radar, weren't they?
Yes, and this area of New Mexico...
This was damaged to the actual beings inside. They'd not come across radar beams before.
Well, strangely, I don't think the Roswell one was actually known about until the 1980s. Although it is more well known now, then I don't think it was known about at all. But you're right in the radar in that the world's most powerful radar systems was in New Mexico at that time, and I believe there were 3 radar sites near where the Aztec craft landed, because it didn't crash, it landed. But like I say, some very, very reliable witnesses. But
I believe it was actually dismantled on site and then put on trucks that were labelled with danger explosives or something, and driven by an elaborate route back to White Sands Missile Base.
Okay. And the cabin was alleged to be 18 feet in diameter, and the outer section of the craft rotated with some kind of gearing mechanism with the inside of the craft. Phenomenal information, and it's amazing how this doesn't really get out into a broader audience. I mean, I know that there have been people come forward to try and pollute this case, put disinformation out on it. People who've said, certain things about it, who then turn out to be, something else. So I think there has been disinformation poured on it. But large rings of metal which revolved around a central stabilized cabin with no rivets, bolts, screws, or welding structure. Right, I've actually got a copy of Timothy Good's latest book here, and there's a chapter on the Aztec case. And basically what it says is that the most classified section of this project was the craft's mechanism that powered it.
Propulsion system.
Propulsion system, stroke, energy system. And it says that was more classified than the atomic bomb. So what they were finding in these crafts, in terms of the propulsion and energy systems, is possibly the reason for the secrecy
beyond
surrounding...
top secret,
Beyond top secret, exactly.
That's the alien agenda.
Okay, and if we come on to that, the energy systems that power these craft, perhaps that's the real reason behind the secrecy, do you think?
That is, I think that's 90% of it, yes, definitely.
Because we were discussing earlier the ramifications for over-unity type energy. In other words, energy which doesn't come from nowhere. It basically that could replace our own fossil fuel burning systems or even nuclear systems.
Sure. But I mean, it also, if you want to maintain a superior position, as any person in government or authority would do, then, if you possess secret information that is, that radical, and you can withhold that from the public, it's just another level of control, isn't it?
Yeah, it would put you at a massive advantage if you have that energy technology.
And if we disclose the energy, the oil will go out the door. Trillions and trillions of dollars and pounds would be down the drain, wouldn't it?
And the other thing that we touched on as well was the fact that it may be that their energy solution or their energy system is actually quite easy to manufacture
Very
for the man
simple,
on the
yes.
street if he only had the instructions.
And they wouldn't like the man on the
I
street.
mean,
or
who
if
knows?
third world country
Maybe
having
there's
it.
some simple way of turning matter into antimatter without all these complex, particle accelerators and things. And just by doing that, then you've got an annihilation reactor which will produce, instant energy with a complete burn where 100% of the energy is converted.
Yeah, using ordinary household materials.
Yeah, and who knows? I mean, maybe the end of a pencil would be sufficient energy to take you to the moon and back.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
It probably is, yeah. You just need an annihilation reactor that you borrowed from your local UFO.
Yeah, okay. And so what about the theory then that the reason why they're not disclosing the information is because the aliens themselves have put the dampers on that information. The aliens do not want disclosure. It's not necessarily human beings that are orchestrating the cover-up.
Well, I mean, the thing is that would then be an acknowledgement by human beings that the aliens are superior to us in every respect, and that's not a very human trait, is it, for people in government, particularly high in government, to actually back down and say, well, we'll do what you tell us. They're the ones that tell everyone else what to do, not usually the people that are told what to do.
Yeah, that's a good point, because
there's just natural arrogance there, isn't there?
Yes, there is natural arrogance in our armed forces, and there are many, many cases of our armed forces firing at UFOs and often losing aircraft and losing lives because of it. So, yes, that's a good argument against the fact that it could be the aliens themselves that are orchestrating the cover-up. But we touched on the nuclear bases. They obviously interfere in that way. But you think it's a human factor which is preventing the information from
I
getting out?
think it's exactly the same as if suddenly everyone was told that religion that you've believed in for the last 2,000 years or however long, etc., has all been a complete misunderstanding, and it's all just a story that somebody wrote down in a book, and that it isn't something you should dedicate your life to or believe in.
It wouldn't be good for the human race,
society would fall apart, wouldn't it? Because it's based around, people need that sense of continuance, that nothing much changes from yesterday, and if it does change, it only changes a little bit. We don't want any big changes. It tends to upset people.
Okay, right. Well, it's time now for our Artist of the Week, but we are going to talk some more after the second break, and we're going to touch on alien abduction and possibly animal mutilation and bring those factors into the equation. Okay, so take it away.
big fears. We place our leaves, but we just can't reach. Well, we're stuck in the world like a giant leech. All the children learn as the parents teach. Oh, no. Trying to get to the top. Oh, but they keep coming up. Yeah, you better open your eyes, see through their lies. Open your mind. Yeah, you're scared of what you might find. Open your mouth, go let it out. You gotta fight for the right. Yeah, you gotta fight for your right. CIA's got UFOs in the USA, and they keep covered up. CIA's got UFOs in the USA, and they keep covered up. So the CI of the CIA's got UFOs in the USA, they keep covered up. Keep it covered up. Since DCI on the CIA's got UFOs in the USA, and they keep it covered up. Yeah, 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 they keep it covered up. Chief, that's what they say. I was gonna believe you anyway. They're spending $1 billion every day, but they're hiding that truth away. Oh no. So they keep it covered up. They keep it covered up. Keep it covered up. Keep it covered up. Keep it covered up. Yeah, to keep it covered up. Yeah, to keep it covered up. Yeah, to keep it covered up. You gotta fight to disclose what they covered up.
The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories. The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome back on board the Starship. And earlier this week I was looking at the BBC website and I noticed an article about the CERN Hadron Collider. And it said that scientists have developed a means of listening to data produced by subatomic particles such as the Higgs boson. So they're going to try and use this to help them detect the emergence of the Higgs boson, which according to them is the Higgs boson is what gives matter its mass, and we'll come on to that in a second. Just have a listen to some of these sounds. This is what energy from the Higgs boson particle may sound like. Okay, and we've got another one here, which is, this one is what the Higgs particle's harmonic signatures may sound like. third one is how an emerging and decaying Higgs particle may sound. Now, I'm not particularly convinced by this listening to the sounds of subatomic particles. Subatomic particles don't emit sound by their very nature. Sound is produced by air molecules vibrating through space, so subatomic particles don't have sounds. So I decided to email John Duffield, who's an expert on physics, and the first thing he said to me that the Higgs boson giving other particles mass stuff is garbage, and that the article looks like a press release intended to promote CERN in the eyes of the public via a compliant BBC. I don't know whether the Higgs boson gives other particles their mass garbage comes from the BBC or from CERN themselves, but CERN don't seem to make any effort to correct this myth. It's definitely a myth because there's a book by a CERN guy called Gian Francesco Gudis, where he states that the Higgs mechanism is responsible for only 1% of the mass of ordinary matter and 0.2% of the mass of the universe, once you factor in dark energy and so-called dark matter. It's got nothing to do with the mass of the electron. So what John's saying is that basically this Higgs boson being responsible for all mass is wrong. It's a tiny amount of a particle's mass, and it doesn't have anything to do with creating the mass of an electron. Anyway, we've rather liked that silly idea of subatomic particles having sound, so we've decided to create some of our own. And the first is an electron orbiting a hydrogen atom. And the next one is the sound of DNA creating protein molecules by assembling amino acids together. And finally, we've got the creation of hydrogen sulfide by adding sodium sulfide to hydrochloric acid. Right, yeah, I do apologise for the schoolboy toilet humour. We're talking with UFO researchers Dale Bolton and Ged Dunbar. Now, we were talking before the break, chaps, about the reason why we don't get disclosure from our governments about UFOs. I'm just going to throw another possible reason into the pot. And that is that in 1954, allegedly, Eisenhower met with extraterrestrials and he signed a treaty with them, and it's allegedly called the Grey Order Treaty. And in that treaty, which was again allegedly witnessed by another group of ETs who kind of rubber stamped this treaty. And in that treaty, he allowed or said that the aliens could continue abducting human beings, you know, through the abduction program that we know of today, through people like Professor John Mack. Now, if you consider that he's allowed them to do that, apparently there is this agreement across all planets in the galaxy that races should not interfere with developing races on other planets. But perhaps the reason why the alien greys, as it is alleged, do this is because Eisenhower signed away that treaty. So therefore, perhaps, as part of that treaty, there was agreement between both sections, both the human element and the ET element, that the mass populace was not to find out about their being here, because it would affect their abduction program. Their abduction program, by its very nature, has to be covert. And they agreed to give the military intelligence information about who they were abducting and when and all the rest of it. And if you look at Dan Sherman's evidence, who was trained in telepathy, it suggests that they did have a program for the ETs to give information about abduction. So that could be a reason for non-disclosure. But that would suggest that there is perhaps an alien hand in the fact that the information isn't coming out.
And the government got technology in exchange.
Yes, as part of that agreement, the government would give them technology. So they've sold our right away, I guess, to
abduct us.
Yes.
I'm just a little concerned here about the fact that we've got potentially alien races that are all part of this United Federation of Planets, if you want to call it that, and yet they obviously developed from a completely different source and a different origin to us, and yet they're the sort of people who sit around together and form a treaty and get signatories to it. I mean, it sounds very human. It doesn't sound very alien.
Yeah, but apparently they...
But what is alien?
Well, what alien is we've got bigger weapons than you, we'll grab whatever we want, and you will not mess with us. That's alien.
Yeah, but it's been proven over the past that they haven't, you know, they've been knocking out the nuclear arms.
Yeah, but the point is that, you know, if you've got that any sufficiently advanced form of technology is like magic. You know, that's how it appears. So therefore, if you've got that kind of technology and you want to abduct this person, or, you know, Dorothy somebody in the middle of nowhere, then you can do it. You don't need any permission from anyone else. I mean, that's the sort of thing that humans do. Humans get permission from by forming a treaty with, you know, this country and that country. But why should an alien, surely an alien race would have an alien type agenda, wouldn't they?
Well,
but we don't know what an alien type agenda is, do we?
Well, that's what we're discussing.
Yes, but if that universal law does exist, whereby all these other species and, you know, life forms will object if those grey aliens start abducting humans, okay, perhaps they wouldn't do it. But because we've signed this treaty, they can then say, well, actually, these humans have agreed to it, so we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah. So these people hold such a high ethical and moral view about the essence of the humanity of all living things in the universe, and yet if one person is allowed to sell out another person, that's okay, as long as they've signed. It's our get out clause, is it?
Well, it's the same with animals and animal reserves, isn't it? We look after some animals and we put preservation orders on others.
Well,
we probably haven't got the preservation order.
But that's true. But the point is that you know, we can do as we like. We want to go kill all these endangered animals. You know, there's very few people to stop us from actually doing it, apart from public opinion. You know what I mean? But by the fact that, you know, all of this just sounds very much like a human agenda that is there. I mean, you know, supposing these aliens are not like us. I mean, they could be electrical. They could be, you know, made of a substance that is a liquid. It could be anything. Why do they? Why is it that everyone seems to look at this? All the scientists look at it as, well, they couldn't come here because, and it's such large distances. Well, they're talking in terms of rockets, not what they'd have 10,000 years in the future. But yet, this is, you know, intelligent scientists seem to waste everyone's time by saying, but this is what you know, because this is all we can do. This is all that anyone could do.
100 years ago,
I mean,
they wouldn't even have computers, would they?
No.
I'm not talking about this Greada Treaty, you know, because I think that's the way aliens think. I'm saying that it's there because whistleblowers have given testimony, like Phil Schneider and others. There are others who have given testimony about the Eisenhower meeting, that an agreement was made. So.
I presume that they've also written a book about this treaty and what the whistleblowing that they've actually done. They haven't just blown the whistle and that was an end to it.
I think so. I think Timothy Good has a few witnesses in his book who worked for the military who witnessed the Eisenhower, you know.
So they all wrote. I mean, presumably this information also helps to sort of promote his book.
Timothy Good's book. Yes, but I mean, I think these are probably actually quite small parts of the book.
But can you rule out completely vested interest?
What, with Timothy Good? Are you suggesting Timothy Good makes up everything he puts in his book?
I'm suggesting that it's a possibility in the same way that alien visitors are.
Right, okay. Well, I mean, it's not just Timothy Good's book where this evidence exists.
Yeah, it just seems as though, you know, most of these people who come forward and saying, well, you know, we've kept our secrets long enough and we want to tell the world about it. We want to tell the world about it by writing a book that you can buy from us. Now, I mean, I'm not just being cynical, but maybe some people think that's the only way they can get the information out. But they could do it without profit.
Honestly, if you counted up all of the money that's been made by people who talk about UFOs,
it's very
it's minuscule.
They're not doing it for the money.
They're definitely not doing it for the money. I've met a lot of them, and they're not doing it for the money. They could make money far more money in much better ways, I can assure you. There's not a massive demand for UFO books. It's not a lucrative subject, I don't think.
Right.
But to come back to the the broader picture, let's just say that there are 2 or 3 races which are here. Perhaps one race doing the abduction program, perhaps another race watching what's going on. Do you think there's something approaching in 2012? Do you have any? Do you feel that that's significant, as everybody suggests?
In 2012, no. I think we'll wake up in 2012.
I think
December.
it's just a number.
Another day.
It's just a number.
Just another
Just
day.
a number.
There's going to be, I reckon, in the next 3 years, 4 years, there's going to be a lot of turmoil. There's
Right.
definitely going to be a lot of turmoil. But I think with the human race will still be here in 2012, 2015, and
right.
time will just come.
What about theories like the Anglo-Saxon mission, where there's a top Freemason who was alleged to have blown the whistle on this meeting, which took place in 2005, stating that there's a plan to create a World War III nuclear war with involving Iran and China, which has to happen before 2011.
Well, I can definitely see another war coming.
Followed by a big geophysical disaster, which is
that's another
the war's
one.
going to wipe out half the population, and this disaster is going to wipe out.
But is this prophecy or design?
No, well,
design.
It could be the elite following prophecy, couldn't it?
Well, they've got the ARP technology now, and I'm sure that's being used for earthquakes, and I think you'll see a lot more of that in the future.
Right. And what about the Gulf of Mexico oil spill? Was that deliberate?
I don't think so. I think it was basically doing it on the cheap.
Do you think?
That's what it's like. If you get a dodgy plumber around to fix your house, you know what I mean. Is it any wonder that your bathroom's flooded one day?
Well, it's unusual that Goldman Sachs sold 49% of the shares, isn't it? And the director of BP also sold some of his shares before it was.
Okay. And there are rumours that Tony Blair's in line for the CEO job of BP.
Well, it could be, as I say. I mean, there was certainly not honest or not accurate about the information that they gave out, because initially, when the pipe burst, I understand it was throwing out something like 100,000 barrels of oil a day, and they were only admitting to 8,000 to 10,000.
Yeah, small amounts.
Yeah.
The pressure coming out as well is supposed to be quite high, isn't it? It's coming from deep down.
So you don't think it could be a false flag? There could be some political orchestration behind it?
Well, certainly. I mean, it is.
Well, Halliburton would be involved, won't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's helping people like Bush, because the fact that he's coming up for midterm elections, or the Americans coming up for midterm elections soon.
Obama?
You mean Obama?
Obama, yeah. And consequently, it gives him an opportunity to. Play. I'm the strong leader. I care about our wildlife. I care about these people. In other words, whenever anything hits the headlines big like that, I look for, well, what else is going on? If you want me to look over here, what else is going on over here?
Yeah.
And there are things going on. I mean, there's as I say, there's this General McChrystal thing in Afghanistan, where he's come forward and basically said, well, we're not really achieving an awful lot. And we're just upsetting a lot of people.
Yeah, I found it strange that he was sacked just a few weeks after the British Chief of Defence Staff was sacked.
Yeah, well, criticising their masters, you see.
And they don't like it.
But the thing is that again, the president didn't have any choice, because when it comes to authority, he is the commander-in-chief.
Right. Yeah.
So it is difficult, but. Again, as I say, one looks at other parts of the world and says, are there things happening elsewhere? Because I think that there is a lot of this manipulation of the news, where bad news will come out on a certain day, and that'll be overshadowed by something else, which is more focused, etc.
And what about the demonising of Iran with its alleged nuclear weapons program? Do you think that?
What about Israel's nuclear weapons?
Well, exactly.
Why is this not publicised widely? What about the guy who spent 19 years in jail?
Yeah,
Vanunu, the whistleblower.
I mean, a lot of people have never heard about this guy. But when the American inspectors actually went to inspect the site, which is, I think, in northern Israel, that was alleged to be working on various pieces of nuclear material. they'd actually bricked up an entire corridor and plastered it like it had never existed at all. And behind the wall, there was actually a lift that went to 4 further floors that down, where they were actually working with enriched plutonium on their own bombs.
Right.
And you know, the thing is, in some ways, it is very hypocritical. But I think at the same time, the Americans say, well, sooner or later, maybe somebody in the Middle East is going to get the bomb, and therefore they, you know, it's handy to have someone there who, if they use their bomb, we can say, oh, you shouldn't have done that, we want to distance ourselves from you. But also it's very useful because we can't use ours, because if we use ours, then we'll drag other people into it.
And of course, Israel haven't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Exactly.
So what I can understand is, why isn't everyone campaigning to get them to sign it? They should be just in arms about that as they are about Iran. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The fact that they didn't sign that agreement.
Well, again, I think that there's a long-standing relationship, you know, with the American government, and also much of the technology that the Israelis are using as part of their nuclear program is supplied by the French. So you know, it doesn't seem to matter who you are if somebody's selling something to you, but you know, from a political standpoint, I think it was as early as 1968 that the Israelis actually developed their first working nuclear weapon.
Okay then, chaps. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Perhaps we'll get you back to talk about the central banks and their influence on world power, because
that would be an interesting subject. Yes.
Okay. All right then. Thanks, Dale.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Jed.
Thank you, Richard.
And it just remains for me to say, keep your eyes on the skies, your feet on the ground, and tell all your friends about this show.
The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Is believed to have emerged from Gypsy Lee's palm reading caravan on Newcastle's town moor. It's time to introduce this week's guests onto the Starship. And this week our guests have acquired a wealth of knowledge about the UFO subject, and join me today for a discussion on some of the most compelling worldwide UFO cases. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get them beamed up onto the ship. It's Ged Dunbar and Dale Bolton.
Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Richard.
Okay. Now we had a little discussion last year, wasn't it, 2009, down at Milton Keynes?
That's correct.
But obviously this is a vastly improved set on the Rich Planet
Great
Starship.
view too.
Okay, now you've come on board today to talk about convincing UFO cases throughout the decades, and we're going to start with Dale, who's going to introduce an event which happened in 1967. Do you want to take it from there, Dale?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this seems to be a little known story, but I think one that is very significant in that in 1967 in Montana, you know, in America, there was a large missile base that controlled a whole load of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And to give you some idea of the sort of power that we were talking about and the importance of the job that the Minutemen missiles were actually doing. Each missile contained around 33 times the explosive power of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and each missile contained 3 of those warheads. And the people that were trained to proceed with the launch procedures, etc., were psychologically screened first. They weren't people that were subject to any flights of fancy. They were basically almost like human machines that were reliable.
Highly credible witnesses.
Highly credible witnesses. And at the time, they were in a bunker 60 feet below the ground on duty, basically protecting the United States from any sort of foreign attack from the Soviet Union. They received a call from the guardhouse in the capsule area where they were 60 feet underground that there had been strange lights actually seen hovering over the main gate, which they basically didn't attach too much importance to and concentrated on focusing on their mission. Then they received a second call from a very alarmed senior guards officer saying that he had seen some sort of craft hovering above the gate and beaming a light onto different parts of the base. And at that particular point, 10 separate ICBMs shut down completely. All control over the missiles was lost. A short while after, that was at their base, but there was basically the way the American defences are laid out. There's a chain of launch stations all the way across the United States. There was a second base where a further 8 missiles were shut down. Now, these missiles are in hardened silos that are particularly protected against things like electromagnetic pulses. So when a nuclear weapon goes off, it creates so much magnetic energy. It's designed to fry electrical circuits and shut down computers and basically stop cars from working, or to help disrupt the infrastructure of a nation. So they're in hardened silos. So an ordinary advanced sort of weapon that would emit an electromagnetic pulse would not have worked. And yet at the same time, the whole lot, 18 missiles, were shut down. There was an investigation by Boeing Corporation that were responsible for the actual manufacture of the launch systems. And after a lengthy investigation, they just couldn't find what actually shut these things down. But it caused a lot of fuss because at that particular time, a significant portion of American defense systems were completely neutralized.
And Robert Salas, who was the Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander who was in that silo, he spoke at the Disclosure Project conference, I believe, and gave his account of basically
just
these missiles becoming inactive. And he stated that it definitely was not a power outage.
Yes.
That something had sent a signal to those missiles to disable them, basically. And there is evidence that this was covered up. You said that there was an Air Force investigation.
Well, there was an Air Force investigation, an investigation by Boeing, and the Air Force maintained that they've actually released all of the information under the Freedom of Information Act. But it seems clear that there were other pieces of information that were not released, which still remain classified, because I think that generally, even if you're not particularly worried about UFOs, but you're worried about your own domestic audience in the United States and the Soviet Union, if you can say, well, something shut down our missiles, then it doesn't necessarily send a message out of that we are a credible nation that can protect itself. So I think that there's another good reason of wanting to cover it up. But I also ask myself the question of, well, if this was some sort of extraterrestrial event or it was an alien visitation, was it because of the fact that they were aware that one of those particular missiles or multiple missiles were due to become defective or a failure in the computer system, and therefore there could be a launch that should have catastrophic consequences, so they shut the whole lot down.
Right. So they were perhaps
so it could be,
watching over a EP job. The reason Blair would be drafted in is presumably because they need someone without a conscience, who is highly skilled at bullshitting to both the media and the public. Sometimes the best strategy to help conceal murderers such as Tony Blair is to give them a high-profile job. This is exactly what happened a few years back to the murderer Andrei Lugovoy, who murdered whistleblower Alexander Litvinenko by poisoning him with polonium-210. He is now a highly respected politician and hero in Russia. The media seem to have forgotten about that story as well. Strangely, earlier this year, Peter Mandelson was rumoured to have been in line for a top BP job. What that lanky, manipulative waste of space knows about the oil industry is beyond me. The G something or other summit was held last week where the world's so-called economic crisis was discussed. Will somebody please tell them that the solution to the world's economic woes is very simple. It is to change the system so that money is only used for its original intention, which was to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. Period. Money should not be created out of thin air by an elite few and then loaned to governments at interest. If you remove central banks and their monopoly on creating all new money, and instead allow our governments to create their own new money, so it doesn't have to be paid back and there is no interest, this would solve the world's economic problems for good. Why haven't they thought of that, Richard, you clever shit? I hear you say. Well, it's because our governments are mere puppets of the elite who own the central banks and would kill any world leader who suggested such a solution. Don't believe me? Well, this is one of the main reasons why President Kennedy ended up like this. In the 1600s, the ruling classes used balls, chains, and whips to keep their slaves in check and do their work for them. Today, they have concocted a much better system to keep you, their slave, working 37 hours a week. That system is called the monetary system and is much more effective than balls, chains, and whips, because most slaves cannot see nor understand the mechanism that enslaves them. But I can assure you, if you work every day of your life and pay taxes, it is enslaving you. Also discussed at the G something or other summit was the axis of evil, Iran and North Korea. America stated that North Korea must be punished for the sinking of a South Korean ship, even though no evidence has been presented to suggest that it was North Korea, an act which the North Korean military vehemently denies. Also, the CIA claimed to have found evidence that Iran are enriching uranium for weapons purposes. The CIA's source.
The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall, and I'm going to start things off with a comment on previous week's news. The alleged oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico now seems to have been forgotten about by mainstream news media. Our view is that they have not been asking the right questions and have merely been putting out the propaganda handed to them by the world's controlling elite. And there is more to this event than merely an accidental oil spill. The BBC news item, which explained the operational headquarters of BP, seemed to be aimed at 2.5-year-olds. In this room they are looking at the blowout preventer, and in this next room Humpty Dumpty is looking through the square window. What can we say about this disaster that the mainstream has failed to report? Firstly, there has been clear obstruction by those involved in controlling the area to prevent the public and journalists from going anywhere near where the alleged spill site is. Contractors who are supposed to be involved in a clean-up operation have all been warned not to speak to anyone about what they know and about what they are doing. Secondly, highly toxic dispersants such as Corexit are being used in massive, unsafe quantities. Some very strange circumstances have led many people to believe that this so-called disaster was deliberately started for some political or strategic reason. Some are alleging that the rig was above an undersea volcano and drilled to depths and at pressures that only previously achieved on land, making this far too dangerous to have ever even been considered, never mind attempted. Others are saying that the video of the oil spilling from the seabed is not genuine and has been fabricated. Also, there are several other oil leaks around the region that are actually the real cause of the oil spill. Toxic rain has been reported on the coasts nearby, which is affecting plant life. Massive security measures have been put in place to prevent people finding out what is really going on. Locals have also claimed that the cleanup operation is simply an empty gesture, and no cleanup operation is actually taking place along hundreds of miles of infected coastlines. The MI5 agent and international war criminal Tony Blair was rumoured in the British press to be in line for the top beast.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jed? Because there are many, many cases of nuclear missile launch facilities having been interfered with by UFOs.
It just seems to be that they are watching over us. It just seems like they're monitoring what's going on constantly. Like we were talking before, and we think they've been here for 1,000 years, definitely hundreds of years. The UFO sites have been going back at least 2, 3, 4 years.
Maybe we're like children playing with matches.
Yes, yes. I think it was Dean Rose on a radio show who recently said that it was like the school teacher coming in the schoolyard,
exactly,
sort of taking the weapons off the children, basically. And I think there's a guy called Bob Hastings who's actually written a book purely about nuclear missile cases involving UFOs. And we can possibly mention the Rendlesham case here, I think.
Yeah, the Rendlesham Forest case, yes.
Because that was allegedly the biggest storage area of nuclear missiles in Europe at that time, in 1980. So it appears that they have a great interest in nuclear missile sites. So you would think that they're just keeping an eye to stop us from. I mean, is that for their benefit or our benefit?
If you take the view of the fact that we are effectively like a project where they're watching over us to see how we develop, whether we develop to higher levels of consciousness and a better understanding of our place in the universe and science and things like this, then as we develop, there are going to be dangers, just in the same way as your child grows. It comes in contact with dangers.
Yes.
And rather than frighten the child, you try to prevent the danger from occurring in the first place by the least amount of intervention. On the other hand, it could be that they're attracted to these nuclear silos and nuclear bases because of the fact that there would be a continuous stream of radioactive energy being emitted as a result of the highly enriched uranium and plutonium. So it could be that they're almost like a radio source, and the frequency of that radio source attracts them in some way. But that doesn't explain why they're shut down.
Keeping their eye on what's going on, really.
Keeping their eye on what's going
on.
Yeah,
I think we're very dangerous with the toys that we've got.
Basically animals.
I mean, it could be that a nuclear weapon. I mean, we've only set off relatively small nuclear weapons so far. Perhaps the bigger ones can puncture holes in the fabric of space-time, and they know this, maybe. They're more destructive to the fabric of nature than we realise, maybe. And maybe they know that. But there are a few other factors in that particular case. One was actually sited directly over the, where the nuclear missile was, and there was never a technical resolution to the cause of the shutdown.
No, they would never find out what exactly went wrong.
So no engineer could analyse the system and find any fault after these systems. So it was as if they sent a signal, which the specifically correct signal to shut that control panel or whatever it is down.
I would imagine that, if you're the President of the United States and somebody rings you and says, we've lost control of 18 of our Minuteman missiles, each with 3